There is a city you know. It announces itself from 40 miles out on a clear day, a serrated crown of glass and steel rising from a flat Atlantic horizon. It is the loudest city on Earth, possibly the most photographed, certainly the most mythologized. 8 million people moving through it on any given weekday, generating a noise floor that has been measured in certain midtown blocks during rush hour at levels indistinguishable from the interior of a diesel locomotive. It does not invite quiet contemplation. It does not suggest concealment. Everything about New York City, the scale, the velocity, the sheer aggressive visibility of it, seems to say, there is nothing here that has not already been seen. And then there is the other city, not on any official map, distributed to the public, not in any heritage walking tour brochure, not in the curriculum of any public school in any of the 5 boroughs, not acknowledged in any press release issued by the Metropolitan Transit Authority, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, or the Office of the Mayor. At least not in language that connects the individual pieces into anything resembling a complete picture. But it is there, below the asphalt of Fifth Avenue, below the marble floors of Grand Central Terminal, below the concrete foundations of buildings that have stood for 150 years, below the subways that 8 million people use every day without once considering what might exist beneath them. There is a second city, layered, contradictory, unmapped in its totality, and in certain sections so deliberately obscured from public knowledge that the obscuring itself has become one of the most significant historical facts about it. This is the story of that second city. All of it. The parts that have been cautiously acknowledged in official histories, and the parts that have not. The tunnels whose existence the city government has confirmed, but whose full extent it has declined to discuss. The vaults whose purpose is public knowledge, but whose security architecture remains classified. The communities whose presence the surface world preferred to pretend did not exist. The technology that is now, for the first time, allowing researchers to see through the rock and the concrete and the deliberate institutional silence to something closer to what is actually there. It is a story told in fragments, because fragments are all that the official record provides. It is told in gaps, because the gaps are, in many ways, the most revealing parts. And it is told with the understanding that what lies beneath New York City is not simply infrastructure. It is history, the history of power and secrecy and survival, and the specific, recurring, structurally motivated decision to build certain things in the dark rather than in the light. We begin, as any serious investigation must, not with the most dramatic revelation, but with the most basic question. What, exactly, is underneath this city, and why? After more than 3 centuries of continuous urban development, does the honest answer to that question remain so stubbornly incomplete? The surface delusions stand at the corner of 42nd Street and 8th Avenue at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, and the city will seem, in the most visceral possible sense, to be a thing of surfaces. The noise is percussive, layered, nearly physical in its pressure. Diesel buses, pneumatic brakes, the oceanic roar of 10,000 simultaneous conversations. The bass thrum of a subway, train accelerating under your feet with enough force to vibrate the fillings in your back teeth. The smells are aggressive and immediate. Hot asphalt, exhaust, the specific steam and iron scent of a subway grate exhalation that is instantly recognizable to anyone who has ever lived in this city, and instantly nauseating to anyone who has not. Everything about this intersection demands your attention to the present moment. There is no invitation to wonder what lies below. This is not an accident. Cities do not simply happen. They are engineered, not just in their infrastructure, but in their phenomenology, in what they make you look at and what they train you not to see. New York City has been engineered over the course of 3.5 centuries of continuous development to present an overwhelming surface, to make the visible so insistent, so loud, so constantly demanding of attention that the invisible simply does not register. The invisible, in this context, is enormous. Beneath that corner, at 42nd and 8th, within a vertical distance of perhaps 200 feet from where you are standing, there is more engineered space than exists in many small cities. There are active subway lines on at least 3 levels. There are utility corridors carrying steam, water, sewage, electrical conduit, fiber optic cable, and gas lines in combinations that no single agency has comprehensively mapped. There are abandoned transit infrastructure from 4 different eras of construction. There are drainage channels whose original construction predates the existence of the United States. There are, if the accounts of workers who have spent decades in the sub-basements of this block's buildings are to be believed, horizontal passages connecting certain properties in ways that appear on no building permit ever filed with the city. And below all of that, at depths that vary from 20 to 80 feet depending on location, there is the bedrock, the Manhattan schist, a metamorphic rock of extraordinary hardness and stability that was laid down roughly 450 million years ago, and that is, in many respects, the true foundation on which everything above it ultimately rests. It is this bedrock that makes New York's skyscrapers possible. It is this bedrock that makes the Federal Reserve's gold vault secure. And it is into this bedrock that certain of the most significant and least discussed features of New York's underground have been cut. the engineering reality. A structural honeycomb. The first thing that anyone who has ever worked in New York City's underground, as a transit worker, a utility engineer, a construction supervisor, a tunnel inspector, will tell you is that the popular image of what is beneath the streets is almost entirely wrong. The popular image, if one can generalize from the way the underground appears in tourism literature and casual conversation, is of a subway system. Maybe 2 levels. Maybe a few utility pipes, and then bedrock. The reality, as anyone with actual experience of the underground will confirm, is of a structural honeycomb so complex that even the agencies responsible for different pieces of it do not have a complete picture of the whole. The Metropolitan Transit Authority operates approximately 245 miles of active subway routes and maintains another significant mileage of former routes in various states of activity and abandonment. Con Edison operates an underground steam distribution system, the only one of its scale in the Western Hemisphere, that runs through tunnels beneath Midtown Manhattan, some of which date to the 1880s. The New York Claims City Department of Environmental Protection maintains a water and sewer infrastructure that, if laid end to end, would stretch from New York to Los Angeles and back. Verizon, AT&T, and their predecessors have been running communications infrastructure through the city's underground since the telephone was invented. None of these systems was built in coordination with the others. At least not comprehensively. They were built by different agencies and private companies across different eras with different standards, different documentation practices, and different institutional memories. The result is an underground that has been compared by engineers who have had to work in it to a geological core sample from an archaeological dig, layer upon layer of different eras of construction, each sitting atop the previous, without any single document that captures the relationship between them. The word that engineers use for this is conflict. A conflict, in underground engineering parlance, is what happens when the team building a new piece of infrastructure discovers that the space they planned to use is already occupied by something from a previous era that wasn't on the maps they were given. Conflicts are normal. They are expected. What is less frequently discussed is that every conflict is also, in a specific and significant sense, a historical discovery. When a Con Edison crew drilling a new conduit break through into a brick-lined passage that predates their oldest records, they have discovered history. And what they do with that discovery, whether they document it, whether they report it, whether they simply work around it and move on, determines whether that history survives. The history, in the overwhelming majority of cases, does not survive. The anomaly that started this investigation in the spring of 2019 a construction crew working on a telecommunications infrastructure upgrade in Lower Manhattan. The specific location was not disclosed in the contractor's subsequent filing with the city, and the filing itself was removed from the public portion of the Department of Buildings database within 6 weeks of its submission. Broke through a concrete wall in a sub-basement level and discovered what the crew foreman described in his internal incident report as a horizontal passage of undetermined length. Brick construction, approximately 7 feet in height and 4 feet in width, running in a roughly northerly direction. The passage was not connected to any active utility system. It was not on any map in the contractor's possession. It was not referenced in any of the historical infrastructure documentation that the contractor had been provided as part of the project's pre-construction survey package. The passage was dry, which suggested that it had been sealed from any active water system at some point in the past. The brickwork, which the foreman photographed with his phone before anyone told him not to, was of a type consistent with late 19th century construction, and at the far end of the visible portion of the passage, which extended perhaps 30 feet before disappearing into darkness, there was a doorway, framed in stone, not brick, of a construction style that the foreman, who had been working in New York's underground for 22 years, said he had never seen before. The project supervisor was notified. The project supervisor notified the general contractor. The general contractor notified the client, whose name does not appear in any of the documents that became available through sources who asked not to be identified. And within 48 hours of the discovery, a concrete pumping truck arrived at the site, and the passage was sealed. No archaeological assessment was conducted. No heritage notification was filed with the city's Landmarks Preservation Commission, as is required by law when construction in New York City discovers features that may be archaeologically significant. The photographs the foreman had taken were still on his phone when his employment was terminated 3 days after the sealing for reasons the contractor described as restructuring. This is where the investigation of New York City's underground begins, not with the famous stories, the presidential train, the gold vault, the people who live in the tunnels, but with this, a discovery made, a document filed, a document removed, a passage sealed, a man fired for having seen something he was not supposed to see. This is the pattern. This is how New York City manages its underground history. And once you know the pattern, you begin to see it everywhere. On October 27, 1904, the first public subway in New York City opened for service. The mayor, George McClellan Jr. was given the honor of operating the train on its inaugural run from City Hall Station to 145th Street. McClellan apparently enjoyed the experience so much that he refused to surrender the controls to the professional motorman and drove the train the entire length of the route himself, to the considerable alarm of transit officials who had not anticipated this development. The station from which McClellan's unauthorized motorman adventure began was the most architecturally significant transit space ever built in the United States, and possibly in the world. City Hall Station was designed by the firm of Hines and Lafarge, the same architects responsible for the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, and they approached the assignment with a seriousness of aesthetic purpose that the subsequent history of American subway design has never come close to matching. The station's vaulted ceiling is tiled in Guastavino tile, a self-supporting system of interlocking terracotta pieces that achieves the structural strength of concrete with the visual elegance of ceramics. The arches are graceful. The skylights flood the platform with natural light, filtered through the street grating above. The ironwork is ornate without being fussy. City Hall Station was, in other words, a masterpiece, and it closed permanently to public passenger service on December 31, 1945, and has been used for almost nothing since. The official explanation for the closure is simple and not, on its face, unreasonable. The station's platform was too short and too curved to accommodate the longer subway cars that the MTA introduced in the 1940s, and the geometric constraints of the site made extension impossible. Passengers who wanted to use the nearby Brooklyn Bridge Station, 3 blocks north, could do so on the same line. The economics of keeping City Hall open for the few passengers who used it did not justify the expense. The station was closed. This explanation is true as far as it goes. What it does not explain is why, in the 80 years since the closure, no serious effort has been made to find a public use for one of the most extraordinary architectural spaces in the 5 boroughs. The New York Transit Museum, which operates from a former subway station in Brooklyn, has intermittently offered exclusive tours of City Hall Station to museum members. And these tours are invariably oversubscribed within hours of being announced, demonstrating that public demand for access to the space is substantial. Heritage preservation organizations have periodically proposed adaptive reuse concepts. A museum, a restaurant, an events venue, a public viewing gallery accessible by slow loop of the 6 train that passes through the station without stopping. None of these proposals has been advanced by the MTA. Why? The MTA's stated reason is safety and liability. An abandoned transit space that is technically still within the active infrastructure of the subway system presents challenges, that a building with conventional, above-ground ownership does not. This is true. It is also, as many transit historians and engineers have noted, an explanation that would carry considerably more weight if the MTA had not found ways to open other elements of its historic underground infrastructure. The Transit Museum itself, for example, for public use when the institutional will existed. The institutional will to open City Hall Station has not existed, and the question of why it has not is, if you spend enough time with people who have worked in and around the city's transit infrastructure. Not a question that produces comfortable answers. What it produces, instead, is a collection of oblique references to the fact that City Hall Station's underground connections, the passages that link it to other elements of the city's substreet infrastructure, some of which are still in active use for purposes that are not publicly disclosed, make full public access to the space a more complicated proposition than the official explanation suggests. What connects to City Hall Station through the sub-basement infrastructure of the block above and the utility corridors that run beneath Chambers Street and Center Street? The answer, insofar as it can be established from public sources, is more than the MDA's official communications on the subject would lead you to believe. The municipal building, which sits directly above portions of the City Hall Transit Complex, has sub-basement infrastructure that was expanded during the Cold War for purposes that the city government has acknowledged in general terms without specifying details. The Manhattan Detention Complex, known as the Tombs, is connected to the courthouse complex by an underground passage that is not on any publicly available map. And certain passages in the sub-basement of the City Hall complex run in directions that do not correspond to any active or documented transit infrastructure. None of this necessarily implies anything sinister. Municipal governments have underground connections between their facilities for mundane reasons. Secure document transfer, utilities management, inclement weather movement of personnel, but the combination of extraordinary architectural significance, decades of inexplicable institutional resistance to public access, and documented underground connections whose full extent is not publicly known adds up to something more than the official explanation accounts for. City Hall Station is not simply a beautiful, abandoned subway stop. It is a node in a subsurface network whose full topology has never been made public. Track 61. The President's Secret Railway, the Waldorf Astoria Hotel at 301 Park Avenue, is, by any architectural measure, one of the most significant buildings in New York City, completed in 1931 at a cost that would be equivalent to roughly $400 million in current purchasing power. It was for decades the largest hotel in the world. a monument to the particular kind of civilized extravagance that the American ruling class of the early 20th century was still capable of performing with a straight face. 47 stories of Art Deco grandeur, its twin towers visible from the East River and from Central Park, its lobbies and ballrooms, the setting for a century of state dinners, presidential visits, celebrity gossip, and the kind of discreet business negotiation that requires both the best bourbon and absolute certainty that no one is watching. The certainty that no one was watching extended in at least one specific and historically documented case to a level of secrecy that went considerably beyond the normal precautions of wealth and discretion. Because beneath the Waldorf Astoria, at a level far below the hotel's own sub-basement, there is a private railroad siding. It is connected to the active infrastructure of what was once the New York Central Railroad's Park Avenue line, now the Metro-North commuter rail system, and it was used on at least one documented occasion that has been partially acknowledged in historical sources to transport a sitting president of the United States into and out of New York City without his being seen by any member of the public, any member of the press corps, or any foreign intelligence service that might have been watching. The president was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The year was 1944. The war was in its final phase, and the president's health was deteriorating rapidly, a fact that was being actively managed by the White House's communications operation with a degree of precision that would be recognizable to any modern political media strategist. What was being managed specifically was the visibility of Roosevelt's disability. He had contracted poliomyelitis in 1921 at the age of 39, and the disease had left him largely unable to walk unaided. He used a wheelchair in private. In public, he was almost always photographed or filmed in ways that minimized or concealed the extent of his mobility impairment. Standing at a lectern with both hands gripping it for support, being guided by aides whose role was to steady him rather than to assist with movement, being shot from angles that made a seated position appear to be a choice rather than a necessity. The press corps of the 1940s cooperated with this management, a degree of accommodation that would be inconceivable in any subsequent era of American journalism, and that reflects a specific historical compact between the White House and the Washington press community that has been the subject of considerable subsequent scholarly debate. The understanding was that certain things were not reported, and the president's disability was one of those things. But managing the image in static photographs and carefully controlled press conferences was one matter. Moving the President of the United States through New York City, the most photographed city in the world, with a press corps that included not just American newspapers but international wire services, foreign correspondents, and freelance photographers who operated under no particular obligation to the White House's image management preferences was another matter entirely. Track 61 solved this problem. The siding runs beneath the hotel's basement, accessible via a private elevator that connected directly to the hotel's upper floors, where the presidential suite was located. When Roosevelt visited New York, his armored private car, a custom-built presidential Pullman car that had been modified to accommodate his wheelchair and that weighed, with its armor plating, approximately 142 tons, could be run directly to the siding. Roosevelt could board the elevator in his suite, descend to the siding level, enter his car, and be moved out of New York on the rail network without ever being visible on a street, a sidewalk, a hotel lobby, or any other location where a photographer might be waiting. The armor plating on the presidential car was not primarily about presidential security, though security was certainly a factor. It was about acoustics. An armored car does not creak and settle the way a standard Pullman car does. When Roosevelt was moved in a wheelchair from a corridor to a sitting position, the sounds of that movement, the specific mechanical sounds of a wheelchair being manipulated, the sounds of a person being assisted who cannot fully assist himself, were not audible from outside the car. The secrecy was sonic as well as visual. How many times was Track 61 used for presidential transit? The historical record here becomes frustratingly unclear in a way that seems specifically rather than accidentally unclear. The 1944 visit has been partially documented in the sense that accounts of it exist in sources outside the official government record. Hotel staff memoirs, transit worker recollections, a reference in a secondary historical work published in 1960 that cited an unnamed source within the New York Central Railroad's executive structure. But the full operational history of Track 61 as a presidential transportation asset, which presidents used it, on how many occasions, for what purposes, is not a matter of public record. The Waldorf Astoria underwent extensive renovations beginning in 2017, when its ownership passed to the Anbang Insurance Group following a $1.95 billion acquisition from Hilton Hotels. The renovation has been controversial for multiple reasons, including the displacement of long-term residential tenants and concerns about the integrity of the building's historic public spaces. What it has also done, from the perspective of anyone interested in the building's underground history, is to significantly restrict access to portions of the sub-basement infrastructure that had previously been accessible to the small number of transit historians and journalists who had managed to arrange tours. Track 61 still exists. The siding is still physically present, still connected in theory to the active Metro North infrastructure, though whether the connection is operable is a matter on which the MTA has not issued a definitive public statement. Whether the presidential elevator still functions is not known. What is known? From ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in connection with the renovation project, and referenced in a 2019 engineering assessment that circulated briefly among transit historians before being withdrawn from public access, is that the sub-basement infrastructure of the Waldorf Astoria Complex X extends in directions and to depths that the hotel's public documentation does not fully account for. The unmapped intersections. Where the lines lead here is a fact that the Metropolitan Transit Authority will confirm if asked directly. The abandoned transit infrastructure of New York City. Stations that have been closed. Lines that have been decommissioned. Tunnels that were built but never opened constitutes a physical space of approximately 93 additional lane miles. That is the official number. It is a large number. It is also, almost certainly, an undercount for the same reason that all official numbers about New York City's underground tend to be undercounts. They reflect what has been formally documented, not what actually exists. The unmapped intersections. The places where active transit infrastructure crosses former transit infrastructure, where transit tunnels run adjacent to utility corridors, where sub-basement levels of certain buildings connect to spaces that appear on no building plan, are the most significant and least discussed elements of the city's underground geography. They are significant because they create connectivity that the official record does not account for. They are least discussed because the people who know about them, the engineers, the transit workers, the building superintendents who have spent decades in the sub-basements of Midtown Manhattan, have generally not been encouraged to discuss them publicly, and in some cases have been explicitly instructed not to. The intersection of the City Hall Transit Complex with the sub-basement infrastructure of the municipal building is one such unmapped crossing. The connection between the Track 61 siding and the active Metro North infrastructure is another. A connection that creates, at least in theory, a direct physical link between the underground of the Waldorf Astoria and the entire Metro North Rail network, stretching north through Westchester County into Connecticut. There are others. There is a horizontal passage. Referenced in 3 separate engineering survey reports from the 1970s and 1980s that have been partially declassified through Freedom of Information Act requests, that runs beneath West Street in Lower Manhattan in a direction that does not correspond to any documented transit or utility infrastructure. The passage is described in the engineering reports as of undetermined age and purpose brick construction, approximately 8 feet in height, with evidence of former use as a pedestrian or cargo transit corridor. No follow-up investigation of this passage is referenced in any subsequent documentation. The passage is, as far as the available public record is concerned, simply there, unexplained, uninvestigated, and, in the formal sense, unknown. This is how the underground works, not through dramatic revelation, but through the specific and revealing texture of what is not said, not followed up, not investigated. The unmapped intersections of New York City's underground are not mysteries that have been actively concealed, though in some cases they have been. They are mysteries that have been managed through the institutional equivalent of looking away. Someone saw them. Someone noted them. Someone was told to move on, and the passages remained in the dark beneath the streets, waiting for the investigation that has not yet been conducted. There is a building on Liberty Street in Lower Manhattan that is, by any reasonable measure, one of the strangest structures in the United States. From the outside, it is austere. 14 stories of Florentine Renaissance limestone, completed in 1924. The kind of building that communicates institutional seriousness through sheer mass rather than architectural innovation. It occupies a full city block. Its windows are small and deeply recessed. Its entrance is formal and slightly intimidating in the way that all serious institutions were designed to be. Slightly intimidating before architecture decided that intimidation was not good for brand engagement. This is the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and the building's architectural austerity is not accidental. It is a deliberate communication to anyone paying attention. This is a place where very serious things are kept very seriously secure. The most serious thing, the thing that justifies the limestone and the recessed windows and the 14 stories of institutional gravity, is approximately 5,000 tons of gold, roughly $6,000 billion worth. At current market prices, stored in a vault 80 feet below the street level, resting directly on the bedrock of Manhattan Island. Let that number sit for a moment. $6,000 billion. More gold than exists in the possession of most of the world's nation-states individually. More gold than any private institution in the world controls. More gold in a single location than has ever been concentrated in any other place in human history, including, probably, the treasury of the Roman Empire at its height. Though the comparison is difficult to make precise, because the Romans measured their wealth in sesterces rather than troy ounces, and the conversion is contested among economic historians. The gold does not belong to the United States government, though some portion of it does. The majority of the gold stored in the Federal Reserve's vault belongs to foreign central banks, approximately 36 countries, as of the most recent public disclosure, ranging from Germany and France to smaller nations whose governments have determined that storing their gold reserves in Manhattan is safer than storing them at home. The logic of this determination is straightforward. The Federal Reserve's vault is, by the most rigorous security analysis available, essentially impregnable, and the impregnable quality derives directly from the underground circumstances of its construction, the physics of impossibility, the 90-ton door. The vault itself sits in a chamber that was blasted out of the Manhattan schist bedrock during the building's original construction in the early 1920s. Bedrock, not poured concrete, not reinforced steel, actual rock. The same rock that was laid down 450 million years ago. Harder than most concrete by a significant margin and geologically stable, in a way that no engineered material can fully replicate. The decision to put the vault at this depth was not simply about security. It was about physics. 80 feet of bedrock above a vault is not merely a physical barrier. It is a statement about what kinds of forces would be required to overcome that barrier, and an implicit calculation that those forces are not available to any actor, state or non-state, whose interests might be served by accessing the gold. The vault is sealed by a door that weighs 90 tons. 90 tons. To put this in the context that most clearly communicates its significance. A fully loaded standard 18-wheel semi-trailer truck. The vehicle that moves most commercial freight in the United States weighs approximately 40 tons when loaded. The Federal Reserve's vault door weighs more than 2 fully loaded semi-trailers, and it turns on a single steel cylinder that is engineered to such tolerance that the door, despite its mass, can be moved by a single person turning a relatively mostled wheel. The door does not simply lock. It rotates into a steel frame in a way that creates a seal with the surrounding rock, so that the vault chamber is effectively isolated from the surrounding bedrock. It cannot be cut with conventional tools because the steel from which it is constructed is of a hardness that exceeds the cutting capacity of any portable tool that could be brought to the site. It cannot be blown open because the vault chamber is surrounded by multiple layers of rock and engineered steel that would need to be breached sequentially before the door itself was even accessible. And it cannot be accessed by drilling from above because the 80 feet of solid bedrock between the vault and the street grade is not a material that can be penetrated by any portable drilling equipment in the time frame that would be available to anyone attempting to access the vault without authorization. Below sea level. This is the detail that tends to produce the most visceral response in anyone learning about the vault's construction for the first time. The vault is not simply below street level. It is below sea level. The bedrock in which it sits extends below the level of the surrounding water table, and ultimately below the level of the Hudson River and New York Harbor. This means that in the event of a breach, in the event that some hypothetical actor managed to open the vault through means that no one has yet imagined. The vault chamber would not simply be accessible. It would begin to flood, and would continue to flood at a rate determined by the hydrostatic pressure of the surrounding water, which is very substantial. This is not an accident of geology, it is a design feature. The vault was sited below sea level specifically because the hydrological conditions of lower Manhattan make an underwater location for a vault the single most effective natural security enhancement available. You cannot simply drill down to the vault and walk in. You have to drill down to the vault, keep the water out, and then open a 90-ton door. The sequence of those requirements is, for any plausible unauthorized actor, prohibitive. The Cold War corridors. What the official history doesn't say. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York's official history is unusually detailed and unusually forthcoming for a federal financial institution. The bank publishes tours, educational materials, and a substantial institutional history that acknowledges the vault, its purpose, and the general facts of its construction. What the official history does not address, and what represents the most significant gap in the public understanding of the buildings underground, is what happened to its infrastructure during the Cold War. From approximately 1950 to approximately 1990, every major piece of critical infrastructure in the United States underwent significant modifications to address the specific threat profile of nuclear conflict. This is documented fact, not speculation. The continuity of government programs of the Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and subsequent administrations created an entire parallel infrastructure of underground facilities, hardened command centers, emergency communications networks, and evacuation routes whose purpose was to preserve the functional capacity of the federal government in the event of a nuclear exchange. The existence of these programs is public knowledge. The most famous of them, the Greenbrier Bunker in West Virginia, where Congress was to be evacuated in the event of nuclear attack, was revealed by a Washington Post reporter in 1992. What is not public knowledge? What has never been addressed in any unclassified government document that is accessible through normal research channels. is the extent to which the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's underground infrastructure was modified as part of these continuity of government programs. The gold vault's location, its security architecture, and its hydrological situation made it, from a Cold War continuity of government perspective, uniquely valuable. A facility that is physically impregnable, that sits on bedrock rather than engineered fill, and that is protected by the hydrostatic pressure of surrounding water, is exactly the kind of facility that Cold War planners wanted for the storage of critical assets and the protection of critical personnel. There are accounts from former Federal Reserve employees, from retired military officers who served in Cold War infrastructure planning roles, and from a small number of researchers who have worked through the available declassified documentation of emergency transit connections between the Federal Reserve's sub-basement infrastructure and the wider underground transit network of Lower Manhattan. These accounts describe a connection that would allow assets and personnel to be moved from the vault level of the Federal Reserve to an active transit corridor without passing through the building's public spaces, and, by extension, without being visible on the street. Whether these connections are still operational, whether they were ever operational in the sense the accounts describe, or whether they represent a combination of institutional rumor and the inevitable elaboration that occurs when people discuss classified facilities over time. These questions cannot be answered from public sources. What can be said is this: the Cold War modification of critical infrastructure in Lower Manhattan was real, was substantial, and has never been fully documented in any publicly accessible form. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York is the single most significant piece of financial infrastructure in the United States. The idea that its underground was not modified to address the most serious security threat in American history is less plausible than the idea that it was, and the idea that those modifications have been fully disclosed to the public is implausible on its face. The deepest secrets of the Federal Reserve Vault are not the gold. The gold is the public part, acknowledged, even publicized, because its existence serves an institutional purpose. The secrets are the architecture that surrounds the gold, the connections, the corridors, the emergency infrastructure that was built during a period when the United States government was genuinely and rationally planning for the possibility that New York City might be destroyed, and that the assets and functions it housed would need to be preserved and continued, commuting from somewhere below the blast radius. The open loop, rumors, records, and the limits of the knowable. There is a document in the National Archives, accessible through FOIA, though the process of obtaining it took one researcher approximately 3 years. and the version ultimately released had 17% of its text redacted. That I references in language that is both specific and carefully circumspect. Subsurface transit options for the continuance of financial operations in the event of metropolitan area disruption. The document is dated 1962, the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it originates from a planning committee whose membership and exact institutional affiliation are among the redacted portions. What the unredacted portions describe is a planning assumption that the gold and other physical assets held in the Federal Reserve's vault would need to be moved in circumstances where surface-level transit was unavailable, and that the underground infrastructure of Lower Manhattan provided options for that movement that had not yet been fully evaluated. The document recommends a further study. Whether that further study was conducted and what it found is not known from any source available to non-government researchers. This is the open loop at the center of the Federal Reserve's underground story. The institution is, in many respects, more transparent than most federal financial regulators about the basic facts of its physical security. But the Cold War layer, the modifications, the connections, the emergency transit options, the classified planning that was done between approximately 1950 and 1990, sits behind a wall of continued classification that is, 80 years after the fact, difficult to justify on any security grounds that survive serious scrutiny. The argument for continued classification of Cold War infrastructure planning rests primarily on the proposition that the specific knowledge of where underground passages run in Lower Manhattan represents a current security vulnerability. This proposition has some merit. It also has the convenient effect of ensuring that the full scope of what was built beneath the Federal Reserve Bank of New York during the Cold War remains unknown to anyone outside a very small circle of people who have government clearances and institutional roles that give them a need to know. The tunnels are there. The planning documents suggest they are there. The testimony of people who have worked in the building's infrastructure suggests they are there. The specific shape of what is not in the official record, the gaps where continuity of government planning discussions should appear and do not, suggests they are there, establishing their precise extent, their current operational status, and their connection to the wider underground infrastructure of Lower Manhattan awaits either the declassification of documents that are currently not available, or the kind of comprehensive, ground-penetrating radar survey of the Liberty Street block that no government agency has yet authorized. The Human Labyrinth. From cold steel to dark brick, there is a photograph. taken in 1994 by a photographer named Margaret Morton, of a man named Bob sitting in a chair in a space that does not appear, at first glance, to be underground at all. There are bookshelves. There is a rug on the floor. There is a lamp. There is a window, or something that functions as a window, covered with a piece of fabric that is backlit, creating the impression of natural light. The space is, in the photograph, clearly inhabited, clearly organized, clearly the product of sustained human effort to create an environment that resembles, in its domestic particulars, a living space above ground. The space is in fact beneath Riverside Park in Upper Manhattan, in a section of the Amtrak tunnel system that runs under the park and along the Hudson River waterfront. Bob, in the photograph, has been living in this space for approximately 4 years. He has carried the furniture in through maintenance access hatches, whose locations he knows from direct experience, and has not shared with anyone who might pass the information along to the Metropolitan Transportation Authority or the city's Department of Homeless Services. He has a kerosene lamp and a small propane stove. He has an extensive collection of books. He has, in the space visible in Morton's photograph, created something that is, by any reasonable standard, a home. The story of the people who lived, and in some cases continue to live, in New York City's abandoned and active transit tunnels is one of the most extensively sensationalized and least accurately reported elements of the city's underground history. The sensationalized version, which reached its peak in media coverage in the late 1980s and early 1990s, involves creatures of darkness, feral humans who have lost the capacity for normal social functioning, dangerous and violent inhabitants of a subterranean underworld who represent the ultimate failure of urban civilization. This version is, in almost every particular, false. The accurate version is considerably more uncomfortable, precisely because it does not the comfortable distance of treating the people in the tunnels as fundamentally different from the people above. The Sociology of Darkness. An organized underground community. The community that came to be known largely through Jennifer Toth's 1993 book and the subsequent media coverage it generated, as the Mole People was not, in any meaningful sociological sense, a community of people who had abandoned the norms of surface society. It was a community of people who had been failed by those norms and who had responded to that failure with the same adaptive intelligence that human beings have always applied to difficult circumstances. In the Freedom Tunnel, a section of the former New York Central freight line that runs beneath Riverside Drive from approximately 72nd Street to 123rd Street. At its peak occupancy in the early 1990s, there were an estimated several hundred people living in a range of circumstances that varied enormously from one resident to another. Some were in situations of acute crisis, active addiction, untreated mental illness, recent release from incarceration, without stable housing resources. But others, and this is the element of the story that media coverage consistently failed to convey, were in circumstances that were less crisis-like and more strategic. They were people who had made a specific calculation that the risks and discomforts of underground life were preferable to, or at least not worse than, the alternatives available to them above ground. The Freedom Tunnel had, at its peak, a social structure, not an elaborate one, not a government or a formal constitution, but a set of norms and practices and hierarchies that allowed a diverse group of people to share a constrained space without constant, violent conflict. There were acknowledged community leaders, individuals whose tenure in the tunnel and whose demonstrated competence in navigating the material challenges of underground life had earned them a degree of deference from newer arrivals. There were informal rules about territory, about noise, about the treatment of newcomers. There was a collective understanding of the Amtrak trains that ran through the tunnel on active tracks, including the schedules, the warning sounds, and the safe recesses in the tunnel walls where a person could stand without being struck. This last point bears emphasis because it represents perhaps the clearest evidence of the organizational sophistication of the Freedom Tunnel community. The Amtrak trains that used the tunnel moved at speeds sufficient to kill instantly anyone standing on the active tracks. The residents of the tunnel were aware of this. They had developed collectively and through practical experience a detailed operational knowledge of the train schedules and the physics of the danger that allowed them to live in the same space as the trains without being killed by them. This required information sharing, coordination, and the kind of institutional memory that is transmitted from experienced residents to newcomers. It required, in other words, exactly the kind of community infrastructure that the popular narrative of isolated, feral tunnel dwellers specifically precludes. There was art in the Freedom Tunnel. The graffiti artist Chris Pape, who worked under the name Freedom, had created a series of large-scale paintings on the tunnel walls during the 1970s and 1980s. Work of genuine artistic quality that gave the tunnel its informal name, and that represented a kind of civic expression, a marking of space as belonging to a particular community that is as old as human cave painting. The residents of the tunnel in the 1990s lived among this art and in some cases contributed to it. The walls of the Freedom Tunnel were not simply the backdrop to a crisis. They were a visual record of decades of human presence in a space that the city had abandoned. Bernard Isaac and the Architecture of Survival. Among the residents of the Freedom Tunnel in the early 1990s, the individual whose story most clearly illustrates the gap between the popular narrative and the sociological reality is a man named Bernard Isaac. Isaac had been a resident of the tunnel since the mid-1980s. He had, over the course of nearly a decade, constructed a living space in the tunnel that was, by any reasonable assessment, as fully realized and carefully maintained as many above-ground apartments in the same city. Isaac had a bed, a real bed, not a pallet on the ground. He had shelving constructed from salvaged materials. He had a propane cooking setup that allowed him to prepare hot food. He had a system for managing water, which he carried in from street-level sources. He had a small library. He had, perhaps most remarkably, a working relationship with several of the Amtrak employees who operated trains through the tunnel. Not a relationship of mutual acknowledgement exactly, but a functional understanding in which the train operators knew he was there. And he knew the schedules well enough that the coexistence, while not officially sanctioned, was practically manageable. Isaac was not a person who had lost the capacity for normal social functioning. He was a person who had decided, on the basis of direct experience of what above-ground social functioning offered him, that the underground alternative was preferable. This is a conclusion that requires serious engagement with the conditions that produced it, not the comfortable dismissal of treating it as the behavior of someone whose rationality is impaired. What Isaac's experience illuminates, and what the broader history of the Freedom Tunnel community illustrates, is a set of structural failures in New York City's social infrastructure that the city government has never, in the years since the tunnel community was evicted, fully confronted. The mental health system, the affordable housing crisis, the specific and catastrophic intersection of deinstitutionalization, the mass discharge of patients from state psychiatric facilities that occurred in the 1980s, with the simultaneous collapse of affordable housing in New York City's most expensive and sought-after real estate market. These structural failures produced the Freedom Tunnel community, just as surely as the structural failure of democratic institutions produced the need for the Chinatown tunnel networks in British Columbia's Victoria. People build underground when the surface world has failed them. This is not a mystery. It is a pattern, the systematic erasure. The evictions of the 1990s and 2000s. In 1991, Amtrak announced that the Amtrak tunnel beneath Riverside Park, which included the Freedom Tunnel, was going to undergo rehabilitation, and that all unauthorized residents would need to vacate. This announcement was received with considerably more complexity than the straightforward, legalistic framing suggests. The residents of the tunnel had been there, in some cases, for more than a decade. They had built structures, developed routines, created what was, in the fullest sense, a community. The legal status of that community, unauthorized by any city or transit authority operating in violation of trespass statutes, structurally incompatible with the official use of the space, did not change its social reality. The eviction process that followed was, by the accounts of both the residents and the social workers who worked with them, significantly more complicated than the transit authorities' initial framing suggested. Some residents accepted relocation assistance and moved into above-ground shelter arrangements with varying degrees of stability and success. Others declined the official assistance and moved deeper into the tunnel system or into other sections of the city's underground infrastructure. Abandoned sections of the subway system, utility tunnels, drainage channels that were less well documented and therefore less subject to institutional attention. The city systematically sealed entry points. Over the course of the 1990s and into the early 2000s, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, in coordination with city agencies, conducted a comprehensive program of sealing access points to the underground infrastructure that had been used by the tunnel community. Access hatches were welded shut. Maintenance passages were blocked. Entry points that had been known to residents for years were closed in ways that required significant physical force to overcome. This sealing program was, from the MTA's perspective, straightforward infrastructure management, a security measure, a safety measure, a way of ensuring that the transit system was used for its intended purpose and not as a de facto homeless shelter. From the perspective of the people it affected, it was something more specific. It was the physical instantiation of the city's preference to eliminate a visible problem rather than address its causes. The people who had been living underground did not stop existing when the access points were sealed. They moved further underground, into spaces that were harder to find and harder to document, and in doing so, passed beyond the threshold of visibility that would have required the city to continue engaging with them as a policy problem. There are accounts from social workers who continued to work with the underground community after the sealing program, from transit workers who encountered evidence of continued occupation in sealed sections, from researchers who have spent years documenting the underground social geography of New York City, of a continued underground community that persists to this day in sections of the tunnel system that are genuinely off the map. Not simply underdocumented, but actively unknown to the agency, theoretically responsible for the spaces. People who have been living underground, in some cases for decades, in spaces so remote from the active transit infrastructure that the Transit Authority does not monitor them and has not, in some cases, ever formally surveyed them. How many people currently live in New York City's underground tunnels? No one knows. The City of New York's point-in-time homeless count, an annual census conducted on a single winter night, which is the standard methodology used by municipality across the United States to estimate the homeless population, has never developed a reliable methodology for counting people who are specifically avoiding being counted in locations specifically designed to make counting difficult. The official estimates range from a few dozen to a few hundred. The estimates of the social workers and researchers who have the most direct experience with the underground community range considerably higher. The discrepancy between these estimates is itself the most revealing fact about the underground community's current situation. A population that official counts cannot reliably enumerate is, by definition, a population that has successfully removed itself from the institutional visibility that would force a policy response. This is, in its specifics, exactly what the tunnel community intended when it moved deeper in response to the sealing program. It is also, in its broader contours, the same logic that drove the construction of the Chinatown town tunnels in Victoria and the underground infrastructure of every other community whose survival depended on invisibility. People build underground when the surface world is hostile to them. They move deeper underground when the surface world attempts to follow them in. The technology that changes everything. In 2018, a research team from Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory conducted a ground-penetrating radar survey of a 12-block section of Lower Manhattan as part of a study of urban subsurface hydrology. Specifically, the question of how groundwater movement beneath dense urban environments interacts with the built-in infrastructure above it. The study was funded by a National Science Foundation grant, used standard methodology, and was designed to produce data that would inform urban planning decisions about underground infrastructure resilience in an era infrastructure, sea levels, and of rising sea levels and increasing storm intensity. The study produced all of that data. It also produced something that was not in the original scope of the research. Anomalous readings at multiple locations beneath the survey area that the team's geophysicist described in the technical notes appended to the published paper as consistent with subsurface voids of undetermined origin, located at depths ranging from 15 to 60 feet below grade, with geometries inconsistent with documented utility infrastructure in the survey area. Translated from the careful language of scientific publication, the ground-penetrating radar found holes in the ground beneath Lower Manhattan that should not be there based on any documented record of what is under Lower Manhattan. Some of these holes were where documented utility infrastructure is located: storm drains, sewer lines, subway tunnels. Those were expected. The anomalies were in locations where no documented infrastructure exists, at depths that suggest either natural void space in the bedrock or engineered cavities of unknown origin. The published paper mentioned the anomalies in its technical notes and recommended follow-up geotechnical investigation. The follow-up investigation has not been conducted. The funding for such an investigation would come from city infrastructure agencies, none of which has a specific mandate to investigate underground archaeological features as opposed to active infrastructure conditions, and none of which has found the anomalies sufficiently compelling to redirect resources from other priorities. This is not an isolated case. Across the past decade, as ground-penetrating radar technology has become more widely deployed in urban contexts, for utility location, for geotechnical assessment, for foundation investigation in construction projects, the number of anomalous subsurface readings in the New York metropolitan area has been growing. Not every anomaly represents a significant historical or archaeological feature. Some anomalies are artifacts of the radar methodology, ghost readings produced by the complex interaction of the electromagnetic signal with the city's extraordinary density of utility infrastructure. Some are documented infrastructure that the project's background research simply failed to identify. But some, a consistent and statistically significant fraction, appear to represent genuine unknown voids in the subsurface of one of the most thoroughly developed urban environments on Earth. What LIDAR tells us about the surface of the underground light detection and ranging. LIDAR works by emitting rapid laser pulses and measuring the time they take to return after reflecting off surfaces. From aircraft, it can penetrate tree canopy to reveal the terrain beneath it, which is how the technology was used to reveal Maya city complexes in the jungles of Guatemala and Khmer road networks beneath the forest canopy of Cambodia. In urban environments, it produces extraordinarily detailed three-dimensional models of the surface landscape, models that can reveal subsurface features through their expression in surface topography. Cave systems express themselves at the surface as subtle depressions, circular sinkholes, and anomalous drainage patterns. Mine workings produce surface subsidence in patterns that are characteristic enough to be recognizable in high-resolution terrain data. Buried structures, foundations, vault roofs, covered passages produce microtopographic variations that, while invisible to the naked eye walking across the surface, are detectable in LIDAR data when analyzed by someone who knows what to look for. New York City has been comprehensively LIDAR surveyed multiple times by multiple agencies for multiple purposes. The city's own Department of City Planning maintains LIDAR datasets. The Army Corps of Engineers has conducted coastal LIDAR surveys as part of hurricane resilience planning. The state's Department of Environmental Conservation has used LIDAR for regional landscape analysis. The data exists. In aggregate, it represents one of the most comprehensive three-dimensional records of an urban surface that has ever been assembled. The analysis of that data for subsurface, archaeological and historical features has not been comprehensively undertaken. Individual researchers working in their own time and with their own access to publicly available subsets of the city's LIDAR coverage have identified what appear to be anomalies in several locations. Micro-topographic features in certain blocks of Lower Manhattan and in the former industrial waterfront areas of Brooklyn and Queens that are consistent with the surface expression of buried structures. But the systematic citywide analysis that would be necessary to produce a complete picture of what the LIDAR data suggests about New York City's underground has not been funded, staffed, or institutionally authorized. The barriers are the same barriers that operate everywhere in the study of New York City's underground history. Jurisdictional fragmentation, budget constraints, the absence of a clear institutional mandate to treat underground historical features as a category of resource worthy of systematic investigation. No single agency in New York City's government is responsible for the underground as a whole. The MTA is responsible for the transit underground. Con Edison is responsible for the utility underground. The Department of Buildings is responsible for the structural underground of individual properties. The Landmarks Preservation Commission is responsible for archaeological sites that have been formally designated. But designation requires discovery, and discovery requires investigation. And investigation requires a mandate that does not currently exist for the kind of systematic, proactive assessment that the LIDAR data could support. The full picture. What comprehensive investigation would require and what it would find. There is a thought experiment that illuminates the scope of what a serious investigation of New York City's underground would require. Imagine that tomorrow morning, the city of New York announced the creation of an underground historical survey, a 5-year, fully funded, multi-agency initiative to document, analyze, and protect the archaeological and historical features of New York City's subsurface environment. What would that initiative need to do? And what would it likely find? It would begin with a documentation phase, a comprehensive synthesis of every existing source of information about the city's underground. From the MTA's engineering records, to the Con Edison utility archives, to the building permit records of the Department of Buildings, to the oral history collections of the New York Historical Society, the municipal archives, and the community organizations that hold the institutional memory of the city's immigrant communities. This documentation phase alone, simply gathering and synthesizing the existing records, would be a multi-year undertaking requiring a dedicated team of archivists, historians, and data analysts. It would then proceed to a field investigation phase, using ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive technologies to survey priority areas: the Lower Manhattan waterfront, the City Hall Transit Complex, the area surrounding the Federal Reserve Bank, the Riverside Park Tunnel Corridor, the former industrial waterfront areas of Brooklyn and the Bronx, and the network of abandoned transit infrastructure that runs beneath Midtown Manhattan. The field investigation would identify anomalies for follow-up physical investigation. Carefully controlled archaeological excavation conducted in partnership with the city's Landmarks Preservation Commission and with representatives of the communities whose history is most directly implicated in specific sites. What would this investigation find? Based on the available evidence, it would find, at minimum, several things. It would find documented and undocumented transit infrastructure in volumes and configurations that significantly exceed what is currently in the MTA's own records. It would find evidence of 19th and early 20th century construction, building foundations, utility passages, basement connections, in locations and at depths that are currently unaccounted for in any official record. It would find, in some locations, evidence of use the underground environment by the communities. Immigrant communities, homeless communities, communities whose lives were shaped by legal and social exclusion, that the surface historical record has consistently undervalued. It would find, almost certainly, some things that nobody anticipated. This is the consistent pattern of underground archaeological investigation. Everywhere it has been seriously undertaken. The ground reveals things that are not in the documentary record, because the documentary record was created by institutions with specific interests and blind spots, and the people who built underground often did so specifically to avoid institutional documentation. The underground is where history goes when it cannot survive on the surface. The pattern of selective forgetting, bringing it all together. There is a concept in historical methodology that is worth holding in mind as this investigation draws toward its conclusion. The concept of selective amnesia. All historical records are incomplete. The past is simply too large for any documentary apparatus to fully capture it. But historical records are not randomly incomplete. They are incomplete in patterns. They tend to be most complete about the activities and concerns of the people who did the recording, the wealthy, the powerful, the institutionally embedded, and least complete about the activities and concerns of the people who were recorded upon, the poor, the marginalized, the immigrant, the criminal, the dissident, the person whose life was shaped by forces that the record keepers preferred not to examine. New York City's underground is a case study in this selectivity. The official underground, the transit system, the Federal Reserve's vault, the utility networks, is documented in detail commensurate with its institutional importance. The unofficial underground, the presidential train that moved a disabled commander-in-chief through the city while his disability was being actively concealed from the public. The tunnel communities of the 1980s and 1990s, the passages that served immigrant communities whose survival strategies were subsequently reframed as criminal enterprises. The Cold War modifications to critical infrastructure that were never declassified is documented in fragments, in gaps, in the specific and revealing shape of what is absent from the official record. The underground of New York City is not simply an archive of abandoned infrastructure. It is a physical record of every time the surface world made a decision about what was too inconvenient, too embarrassing, too complicated, or too threatening to acknowledge. Every passage that was sealed without documentation is a piece of that record gone. Every official explanation that answers the literal question while evading the significant one is another section of the story deliberately left untold. Every community that was evicted into deeper darkness rather than housed in sustainable dignity is another chapter in the history of a city that has consistently preferred the comfort of a coherent surface narrative to the complexity of a truthful one. The tunnels are still there. In most cases, the Freedom Tunnel has been rehabilitated and is now inaccessible, but the infrastructure is still present. The physical record still exists in the dark beneath the streets, waiting for the investigation that will take it seriously. The oral histories that could illuminate the human layers of that record are still, in some cases, available. Elderly residents of the tunnel communities, retired transit workers who spent careers in the underground, former Federal Reserve employees who worked in the sub-basement levels of the Liberty Street building during the Cold War. The window for collecting that testimony is not closed, but it is narrowing in precisely the way that all windows of living memory narrow. The technology is ready. The will is the question. The gap between what is currently known about New York City's underground and what could be known is not a technological gap. The technology, ground-penetrating radar, LIDAR analysis, acoustic tomography, chemical dating techniques, exists and is available. It is not a financial gap, in the sense that the cost of a comprehensive underground survey of New York City, while substantial, would be a fraction of the cost of any single major infrastructure project that the city undertakes in any given year. The Second Avenue subway extension, which added 3 stations to the Q train line, cost approximately $4.5 billion. A comprehensive 10-year investigation of New York City's underground historical resources would cost, by reasonable estimation, 1 to 2% of that figure. The gap is institutional. It is a gap in political will, in the recognition that underground historical resources are worth investigating, protecting, and making publicly accessible. It is a gap in the organizational architecture of the city's government, which has no single agency responsible for the underground as a whole, and therefore necessary for the kind of integrated, multi-agency investigation that the question demands. And it is, at a deeper level, a gap in the city's relationship with its own history, specifically with the parts of its history that the official narrative has found most uncomfortable to acknowledge. The history of New York City's underground is the history of the city's poor,
its immigrants,
its dissenters, and its powerful in their most unguarded moments. It is the history of what people do when the surface world refuses to accommodate them, and the history of what institutions do when the evidence of that refusal becomes too visible. It is, in other words, a history that demands not just archaeological investigation, but a willingness to sit with the discomfort of what the investigation might find. That willingness is not unlimited in any city at any time, but it is more available now than it has been in the recent past. The conversations that New York City, that American society, is having about the full history of its public spaces, the people who have been excluded from those spaces, and the physical evidence of that exclusion embedded in the built environment, are conversations that create the conditions for a different kind of engagement with the underground record. The underground is where the physical evidence of those exclusions is stored. It is where the official history ends, and the full history begins. The conclusion: an incomplete map of an incomplete record. This investigation is not complete. It could not be complete because no complete investigation of New York City's underground exists yet. What exists is what has always existed in the study of this subject: fragments. The presidential car on track 61. The Guastavino tiles of City Hall Station, aging in the dark. The 90-ton door of the Federal Reserve Vault, sealing its secrets below sea level. The photographs that Margaret Morton took in the Freedom Tunnel in 1994. preserving the faces of people whose names the official record never held. The anomalous GPR readings in Lower Manhattan, sitting in a research database, waiting for someone with the right mandate to follow up on them. Taken separately, these fragments tell partial stories. Taken together, they describe the outline of something large, a hidden geography of New York City that is older, more complex, more human, and more politically significant than the official map of the city allows for. A geography that was built by people with specific purposes. The purpose of secrecy, the purpose of survival, the purpose of security, the purpose of hiding the evidence of disability from a nation that was not ready to see its president as he actually was. None of those purposes is simple. None of them is simply sinister, though some are more defensible than others in historical retrospect. The presidential secrecy around Roosevelt's disability reflects a media compact that now seems both understandable in its historical context and deeply problematic in its long-term effects on public discourse about disability and the fitness of public figures. The Cold War modifications to the Federal Reserve's underground reflect a rational response to an existential threat that shaped every aspect of American public life for 4 decades. The tunnel community of the Freedom Tunnel reflects not a failure of individual human beings, but the specific and catastrophic intersection of deinstitutionalization, housing policy failure, and the particular cruelty of a city that chose to make certain kinds of sufferings invisible rather than addressable. The underground of New York City holds all of this. It holds the gold that underwrites the global financial system and the people who slept on concrete within a mile of it. It holds the presidential secret and the immigrant survival strategy and the Cold War fear and the architectural masterpiece that has been left to decay in the dark. It holds, in the fullest sense, the unedited history of the greatest city on Earth. The history that did not make it into the textbooks, the heritage plaques, the tourism brochures, and the official communications of the agencies that are technically responsible for knowing what is there. The tunnels are waiting. The anomalies in the ground-penetrating radar data are waiting. Sealed access hatches and the classified engineering reports and the oral histories of people who have spent their lives below grade. They are all waiting for the investigation that will finally take them seriously. That investigation has not yet arrived in full, but the evidence suggests that the direction in which researchers, journalists, and slowly, cautiously, the city's own heritage management apparatus are beginning to look is the right direction. The map of New York City's underground is incomplete. It will remain incomplete until the institutions responsible for the city's history decide that incompleteness is no longer acceptable. Until then, the passages remain. In the dark beneath the streets, beneath the bedrock, beneath the noise and the velocity and the overwhelming surface presence of the greatest city on Earth, holding what the surface has chosen not to see, the investigation continues. There is a kind of historical justice that can only be administered below ground. Above ground, history is managed, curated, edited, presented in forms that serve the institutions doing the presenting. Heritage plaques appear where they are welcome and are absent where they are not. Tour routes include the impressive and exclude the uncomfortable. Official histories acknowledge what reflects well on their authors and decline to engage with what does not. The underground does not manage history. It stores it indiscriminately, democratically, without the editorial judgment that the surface applies to its own past. The tunnel that carried a president's armored car is the same kind of infrastructure as the tunnel that carried an immigrant community's survival supplies. The vault that holds $6,000 billion worth of gold is in the same geological layer as the abandoned station to Station, where an unhoused man built a bookshelf from salvaged lumber. The underground makes no distinction between the histories it preserves. It holds all of them in the dark equally. This is not a romantic fact. It is a structural one, with practical implications for anyone who wants to understand not just what is beneath New York City, but why it matters that the understanding is incomplete. Every passage sealed without documentation is a decision made by someone under some institutional pressure or financial constraint that the history contained in that passage is not worth preserving. Every anomalous, ground-penetrating radar reading that sits in a database without follow-up investigation is a decision made through the accumulated effect of budget allocation adequacy and agency, mandates, and political priorities that the underground is not worth knowing fully. Every oral history of a tunnel resident or retired transit worker that goes uncollected before the person who holds it dies is a decision made by the same accumulated neglect that the human layer of the underground record is not worth the effort of preservation. These decisions have been made systematically and repeatedly across the entire history of New York City's engagement with its underground. They have produced the situation that this investigation has documented. A city whose underground is more significant, more complex, and more historically rich than its surface narrative acknowledges, and less understood than the available technology and expertise would require it to be if anyone in authority had decided to make understanding it a priority. The case for making it a priority rests not just on historical curiosity, though historical curiosity is a legitimate and underrated civic value. It rests on something more specific: the recognition that the underground is where the full history of New York City is kept. The history of the people who built this city, who dug its tunnels, laid its rails, fired its boilers, carried its cargo, lived in its interstices when the surface had no room for them, is preserved in the physical record of what they built and where they built it. That record is finite. Every development project that encounters it and destroys it rather than documenting it reduces the stock of primary historical evidence that future researchers will have access to. Every decade that passes without a comprehensive investigation makes the recovery of that evidence less possible, as the human witnesses to the underground's most recent chapters age and die. The window is not closed. There are researchers currently working on different elements of this story. Urban historians, transit archaeologists, social workers turned documentarians, retired transit workers who have spent decades accumulating knowledge of what lies beneath the streets and are, as they approach the end of their working lives, increasingly willing to share it. There are technological tools, ground-penetrating radar, LIDAR, analysis, three-dimensional mapping software that would allow a determined and funded investigation to produce a substantially more complete picture of New York City's underground than exists today. There is, in the broader cultural moment, an appetite for the kind of reckoning with incomplete and selective historical narratives that a serious investigation of the underground would require and support. What there has not been, and what is needed, is the institutional will to bring these elements together into a sustained, properly funded, multi-agency investigation. One that treats the underground not as an infrastructure problem to be managed, but as a historical resource to be understood. One that partners genuinely with the communities whose histories are embedded in the underground record, rather than treating those communities as problems to be solved or obstacles to be managed. One that produces results that are publicly accessible, genuinely transparent, and adequate to the complexity and significance of what is actually there. New York City is the most investigated city on Earth. Its surface has been photographed from every angle, documented in every medium, analyzed by historians and sociologists and urban planners and geographers for 3.5 centuries. And yet its underground, the physical record of everything that its surface narrative chose not to accommodate, remains in its totality unmapped. That unmapping is itself a kind of history. It is the history of the choice, made over and over by the institutions responsible for the city's self-knowledge. To look up at the buildings rather than down at what lies beneath them. It is the history of the official preference for the surface story, clean, inspiring, legible, over the underground one, complicated, uncomfortable, and true. The tunnels deserve better. The people who built them deserve better. The history they contain, the full, unedited, underground history of the greatest city on Earth, deserves to be told. It is still possible to tell it. The passages are still there. The investigation, at last, is pointing in the right direction. Go down. Look carefully. What you find will change how you understand everything above.